Izuku Midoriya has quickly gone from a nuanced and interesting main character to somebody that struggles to hold any of my interest. He's a character I have always had a soft spot for. I mean, just last month I made an entire video praising his character direction during the war and going over his progression throughout the story. So why is it then that a character I would have considered S tier in MHA now barely hangs on a maybe low B? Just like everything else, My Hero Academia's final act spoils it all. If you didn't watch my previous video, it would help you get some context for my complaints about Deku's current character trajectory. It's not necessary, however, it just helps. Also, do note that this video will have spoilers for the entire series, including the currently ongoing final arc. MHA's final act opened up with Midoriya and his most self-destructive yet, completely obliterating his body to defeat Shigaraki, dehumanizing himself and viewing himself as only a vessel of one for all, grappling with the idea of saving a villain when two of his own predecessors do not support him, with the ticking time bomb known as the state of his arms about to go off, and finally, isolating himself from his friends and loved ones to go on a suicidal mission to hunt the League. Surely, something so painfully and obviously set up couldn't miss. The villain hunt arc, or, if you really like that, the Black Hero arc, that name is abysmal, and by extension the final act in its entirety, did a phenomenal job at completely and utterly destroying every single plotline of interest that was going in Midoriya's favor at this time. For the sake of structure, because I can complain about this for far too long, I'm going to break the following down into sections. Number 1, self-destructive behavior. Number 2, dehumanization. Number 3, empathy machine. And finally, power progression. As mentioned in my previous video and easily observed by, I don't know, anyone watching the series, Deku's self-destructive behavior came to a head in PLW and Villain Hunt. It's a character trait of his that has been present since the very beginning, and you could see it in the war arc when, with all of his limbs broken, everyone fighting around him, and him single-handedly fighting Shigaraki, he still lays on the ground telling himself to stop being worthless. How do you solve such crippling lifelong issues of self-worth? Well, it's not something you could solve in a day, and a good place to start is to examine where it stems from. Remember when Midoriya was, a marginalized member of society that was constantly bullied by his childhood best friend and looked down upon as worthless by society? I don't know, that might just be important to figuring out where these issues come from. The bullying from Bakugo is a core reason for Midoriya's current mindset, something acknowledged by Bakugo himself in-universe. One of the primary driving forces for his atonement arc, the guilt of contributing to his self-destructive behavior. Okay, we can now identify one of the root causes of his current mindset, and the story has now geared up to address his self-destructive behavior. How does it solve it? It doesn't. In Villain Hunt, Deku goes on a month-long rampage across Japan looking for the League of Villains, slowly cutting off the people he's close to and shouldering the burden himself. But what happens after that? Over the course of the month he spent isolated from his loved ones, Midoriya himself never had a conscious thought about his situation. He thinks about other people, which is very in tune with his character, but even at his lowest, we never get any self-reflection on how he ended up here, instead being saved after being at the low point for, a chapter? That's really it? That's not even an entire episode in the anime. Being saved by his friends isn't inherently an issue, because Midoriya needed to stop shouldering the burden on his own. Let's ignore how the story retroactively proved him right for a second by having people get insta-gibbed in their fights. Let's just push that aside. Where the problem arises is that the core flaws of Deku's character that led him to self-isolating and destroying himself were never resolved. He was told that we can help and to take a rest, but that acts only as a band-aid solution to his literal, lifelong systemic marginalization and unironic discrimination and being told he's worthless besides the literal last year. What instead happens is that we don't get any satisfying conclusion or resolution to Deku viewing himself as worthless. We don't get that long-awaited talk between Bakugo and Deku. What we get is a one-sided trauma dump from an abuser onto the victim, only for it to never be mentioned again, and for the abuser's behavior to never really change. The core of Midoriya's character is established on people's treatment of him when he was quirkless, and what should have been this gigantic cathartic moment between the two was instead reduced to a bath gag. What should have been a cathartic moment between All Might and Midoriya post-separation, where the two could have the chance to reflect on their self-destructive tendencies and borderline self-harm, was reduced to a gag where Midoriya says he was as bad as he was because All Might wasn't there for him, which fucking no. The cause of his self-harm was sideswept, and the one person that could have deeply related to that behavior, something acknowledged in-universe, is also sideswept in favor of taking a fucking bath. The issue with Midoriya post-war is that he barely progresses. Villain Hunt is like taking one step forward, and that's kind of it. Something we have witnessed about Midoriya since the beginning of the series remains logically unchanged, never having been addressed. Sure, he understands that he can't take on every villain from the League now, but let's be real, most of this still falls on Midoriya's shoulders, as the second he was removed from the plan, Bakugo instantly fucking died. I can't go too much further into this without going on to topic 2. part of that lack of self-worth and self-destructive behavior culminates in the war arc and beyond, as Midoriya begins to perceive himself as a vessel of One for All and nothing more. He understands that One for All was made to defeat All for One, and he will fulfill that purpose no matter what happens to him. Him believing he has no value and only finally perceiving that value as the power he was given. If you're watching this, you might be going, but Asa, this was solved. Class A came to tell him that they don't care about his power and only care about who he is, which, fair. However, this kind of loops back to the self-destructive behavior where his mental health issues weren't actually really addressed. He was told some kind words and brought back. Not that kind words don't help, but what I enjoyed about My Hero Academia is how it would demonstrate that deep-seated mental health issues or trauma can't be solved by kind words alone. Think of Shoto, who massively subverted the trope of a talk no jutsu that some people might have feared. Deku only jumpstarts Shoto's path of recovery, and it's still a path he must walk on his own, starting off by finally confronting a big part of his trauma, his mom. Midoriya isn't given any time to come to any conclusions himself or have his own thoughts. Being told he isn't his power, but never having a satisfactory moment of, oh yeah, I'm my own human being. But let's just take it, okay? Let's just accept that the conversation aided him, and he took his normal pills and he got better. Did he though? After Villain Hunt, Midoriya has turned into a husk of his former self with absolutely no introspection, incapable of any complex thought apparently. If you read the final war arc, you will be hard pressed to find a panel where Midoriya isn't thinking about One for All or All for One. Seriously, I'm showing panels on screen that will likely be a majority of his screen time, and almost all of it is him thinking about One for All, with his encounter with Toga being probably the only exception. If your goal is to solve the dehumanization of your main character, making him feel even more dehumanized is not the way to go about it. It's counterintuitive, it undermines the themes of the Villain Hunt arc, and makes the solution of Class 1A saving him just feel pretty shit, especially when the way they solved this was right in front of the reader. Midoriya had his own path forward to make himself separate from All Might, to be the one who empathizes with villains and to try and address the root causes. He was gassed up to be this way, only to have that identity partially taken away from him and for him to become a one-for-all machine. It's especially ironic considering that he's supposed to be the one that addresses the root causes, but he won't think for himself about what's happening to himself. He isn't only a one-for-all machine, but he's also. Calling him this might seem weird considering that this is like his thing since the beginning. I'm not intending to criticize his trait of being empathetic, because I find it commendable and used to really enjoy this part of him, but that's the thing. His empathy used to be a part of him, not the whole. He still felt empathy for people like Bakugo with the sludge villain, or Shoto despite wanting to beat him, or Shigaraki despite not forgiving his actions and still wanting him to suffer the consequences. Ever since this goddamn bath, any and all nuance has been stripped from his character. His self-destructive behavior disappeared. The dehumanization of himself stopped mattering. He lost the ability to form negative emotions, and he lost nearly all character relationships outside of Ochako. Despite Hori dropping some absolute stinkers beyond this chapter, MHA 327 still remains as one of the worst chapters of the series due to how much it neutered Midoriya going forward, turning this nuanced victim of hero society into One for All. As mentioned previously, Act 1 Midoriya would want to save people even if he had other goals. He would get mad, he would feel conflicted, he would beat himself up over things, but currently, Midoriya seems genuinely incapable of having nuanced feelings about things. There are two primary examples. Bakugo, which sounds ironic considering I mentioned him earlier, and Aoyama. Bakugo and Midoriya's relationship used to feel somewhat nuanced and enjoyable until the aforementioned lack of official acknowledgement of how much harm Bakugo had done to him. And then we get the apology, which, yeah. Bakugo's apology for Bakugo is really good. But this isn't a video about Bakugo. Like I said a couple sections ago, this is the abuser trauma dumping onto the victim, and Midoriya is left to just fall asleep or something. We never get a conversation between these two where Midoriya gets to actually do any talking. He never gets to tell Bakugo how he made him feel, to reflect on their relationship. He never gets the opportunity to feel a bit conflicted about how he feels before ultimately forgiving Bakugo. He just forgives, and he forgets, without a single thought of his own along the way. I mean shit, when Bakugo apologizes to him, he literally airs his ass before falling asleep. This loss of nuance is also felt through Aoyama. Aoyama was indirectly responsible for a lot. He aided and abetted terrorists numerous times, leading to some of Midoriya's most traumatizing and dangerous moments. Without Aoyama, Aizawa would have had stronger eyes. Without Aoyama, Bakugo wouldn't have been kidnapped, leading to All Might's downfall and Bakugo's own self-guilt. Without Aoyama, Midoriya wouldn't have put his arms on the brink of pure destruction. Surely when Midoriya finds out that his classmate had put him in harm's way, he could have some sort of, at least, negative initial reaction. Instead of these things flashing through his mind and having this rewarding scene of Midoriya still deciding that Aoyama is worth saving, he isn't given the opportunity to think for himself. He isn't given the chance to be nuanced, to be upset about what happened to him, and the only instance we have of that is after Bakugo died, where he was about to prove even more that this arc is a copy-paste of PLW. Instead of coming to grips with what has happened and understanding that repeating his mistakes won't get him anywhere, he has to be calmed down by a janitor. It's a recurring trend where character moments are taken from Midoriya and given to someone else. He doesn't get to think about how he ended up here and snap out of his own rage moment. Mirio gets to. He doesn't get to think about the effects of being a quirkless person in this society. Aoyama does, and Bakugo, of all fucking people, gets to make a comment about quirkless people instead of Midoriya. This is especially awful considering the Bath in 327 had completely eroded his relationships with other characters. Mirio being used as a foil for Midoriya is basically never brought up again. Midoriya never has a single thought about him coming back, grappling with the feeling, even when in Villain Hunt. Midoriya never has a single thought about his relationship with Bakugo, and they effectively stop interacting post-Villain Hunt. We get no satisfying conclusion to Midoriya abandoning All Might, instead having it turned into a gag, and they effectively stop interacting post-Villain Hunt. The kid who felt bad that his friend might have lied to him about having extra quirks, finding out he does indeed have extra quirks, pretty much never gets spoken about again, as they stop interacting post-Villain Hunt. The reason Midoriya has stopped being interesting to me is due to this lackluster addressing of his self-destructive behavior, his dehumanization, and the absolute lack of character and flanderization of his empathy post-Villain Hunt. But unfortunately, that isn't where my problems with Midoriya end. The title of this section might lead you to believing this is some power scaling stuff, but it's really not. I don't care about the power scaling itself. It's more so that Midoriya's power progression was a big part of his character, a through line that we followed throughout the first 5 seasons of My Hero Academia. Something that deeply connected us to Deku's struggles was his adjusting to having a quirk after a life of, well, not having one. It took the kid 3 seasons to utilize 8% of his power, and that is something we witnessed every step of the way. We saw him go from blowing himself to bits to utilizing his fingers and still blowing them to bits, to feeling this huge amount of satisfaction as he reins in 5% of his power. We see him develop as a fighter, learn that he doesn't have to fight like All Might, coming up with his own fighting style and progressing more and more, unlocking stuff like Air Force and being able to use up to 20%, and seeing him come crashing down when Black Whip explodes, basically making him feel like he has regressed. There is a point though where this is lost, where the disconnect begins between Midoriya and the viewer. At some point, Midoriya learns something about One for All that we don't, and we're kept in the dark until the absolute last arc. When we find out about Float, he simultaneously learns about all the other quirks he will have access to, but we, the viewer, have zero clue, and for the first time, we don't know what Midoriya is working towards or what to expect. To make matters worse, Midoriya goes from taking months and months to use 8% of his power consistently to having already mastered Black Whip and leveling up from 8 to 30% in one big time skip. On its own, I could probably forgive that, but it's not the only thing. This painstaking power progression we had witnessed from him was now entirely off-screen. As he had been training for Float, which is shown to us through a flashback, he completely understands Fajin and has almost no struggle using it. Any threat that Dazer's had seemingly posed was fixed off-screen, and Gear Shift alongside Fajin exists to speed boost him to 100% and beyond. The end of Act 2 and all of Act 3 marked the start of our disconnect with Midoriya, as we were slowly separated from his power progression and then who he is as a person and his relationships. One of the most damning parts are his arms, something that was unbelievably instrumental in his early growth. They served as a Chekhov's gun of sorts, something always ticking down, and every reckless decision Midoriya made, he was putting his arms on the line. It was why he had developed shoot style. It was why he had arm braces on his costume to begin with. It was why he made this vow to himself to never use 100% again, and it was why Deku vs. Shigaraki was dripping with tension, only for the story to take that Chekhov's gun off the table and offer a fairly reasonable explanation, but it's yet another thing that takes away from Midoriya's character. Just because something makes sense doesn't mean it's good writing. I'm gonna say something because when you criticize anime or characters in fiction, people get very pressed. None of what I'm talking about in this video is objective. These are my own subjective dislikes about Midoriya's character, and if you disagree, that's perfectly fine. I don't think his flaws were properly addressed. I think he has lost nearly everything that made him interesting. He has lost all meaningful character relationships, and the disconnection of his power progression is the final nail in the coffin. For all the people who don't get why I rate Midoriya so low, hopefully this helps. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe for the funny YouTube algorithm. You can check the description down below to follow me on Twitter, where I'm objectively correct all the time. You can also join my Discord, where we talk about My Hero Academia, ReZero, Jujutsu Kaisen, and stuff like that. And you can also now become a YouTube member, which basically just gives you access to behind-the-scenes content, a little badge on comments, and live stream chats, and access to some emotes. Only do so if you want to support the channel, though. But that's about it, though. Thank you for watching. See ya.